students. Got my coffee and my UCLA mug. Go Bruins! And I'm ready for another lesson. So in this quick video, I'm going to try to cover the next two topics you need to know related to the chemicals that build life and the major biomacromolecules you need to know. Together, these fold nicely into a topic called the biogeochemical cycles. So let's talk about the chemistry of life a little bit more. So when we talk about the chemistry of life, we focus on a few different macromolecules. We focus on proteins. We focus on nucleic acids. Nucleic acids. Hopefully I spelled that right. Lipids. Make that a different color. And carbs. Okay, so this is what makes up the cells. Of course, there's nutrients and other things floating around, but this is what your body has to make when it wants to make a cell. So let's talk about what are the elements that go into each of these, meaning our chemistry elements, things like carbon, hydrogen, etc. So what are the elements? Well, I remember them as CHOMPS. But let's just go through them. So the first element in each and every one of these is carbon. And also we have hydrogen in each and every one of these. So CH, carbon, and hydrogen is in every single one of these. Oxygen is also very important in most of these. Most of them have oxygen somewhere around them. Now, in terms of how we get these elements, the one that we focus on in our biogeochemical cycles is actually the carbon, because unlike hydrogen and oxygen, which we can just get from water and from breathing very easily, carbon we have to get from things we consume. So we will often track and see how we're getting carbon. Well, eventually, actually every living thing gets its carbon from photosynthesis indirectly. So even though we don't get carbon through photosynthesis, sugars are made by plants through photosynthesis, and we consume the plants. We consume things that consume the plant. That's how we get our carbon. So that's how we get our organic carbon from each one of these. So every one of these proteins, nucleic acid, lipid, carbohydrates have carbon and hydrogen. And let's start with lipids because they're the simplest. Lipids are mostly just made out of hydrocarbons. Sorry, I made a mistake. But I caught myself, so that's okay. Carbohydrates are mostly made out of hydrocarbons. So they end up, because they're just hydrogen and carbon, which you can think of as the backbone of the cells. So all of these have carbons because carbon provides a backbone for cells. And let's draw what that looks like. So hydrocarbon would just look something like this usually. It'll just have lots of carbons all making a backbone. And oops, that got messy. Still getting used to my new device. It'll just make lots of carbons all binded together. And each of these corners represents a carbon with hydrogens attached. And sometimes we have cool rings. We call these aromatics. Sometimes the carbons make a ring. But for the most part, the carbons are just long chains of carbons. We call those, which are the basis of carbohydrates. But not just carbohydrates, all of these have carbon chains in it. So we need to get that carbon through what we consume. Now, a little bit more complicated than that is our lipids. Our lipids also have carbons, but specifically, I'm just going to talk about the most important lipids you need to know for this class. Specifically, we have phospholipid bilayers, which involve our long hydrocarbon chains, but also involve a phosphorus-based heads. And so here we have our next new element, we have phosphorus. So in addition to these hydrocarbons for our phospholipid bilayers, which form our layers around our cells, in addition, we need phosphorus in these parts as well. Next, we have our nucleic acid, which is our DNA in the center of our cell, and the RNA, which is how the DNA sends its messages out of the center of the cell. Nucleic acids also involve nitrogen. And lastly, we have our proteins, which is basically all the machinery. So proteins is everything else in the cell. So when it wants to build new organelles, when it wants to send out different things, it needs proteins to perform all its functions. So lipids provide the phospholipid bilayer. Nucleic acid is the DNA, the RNA, that genetic information, and proteins is basically anything else. And the proteins have a very interesting structure. Let's do it in red to match the picture. Is they all look like this. They all have an amino group, which is again nitrogen, you'll notice. Then we have again that carbon chain, and it can be longer, but I'm just going to put an R here. And that's because we call this the R group, and it just depends on the specific part of the chain you're looking at. We'll talk more about that. And then we have our acid carboxyl group here. And this is just one little part of the protein. But if we were to zoom in into just one monomer in this long protein polymer, then this is what it would look like. We would see a nitrogen, we would see a carbon, and we would see this R group. So to sum up, what were all the elements that we need to know? Well, let's go through each of them. We already talked about our CHO. So our carbon, we're getting from the plants we consume. Thank you very much, plants, for getting that carbon through photosynthesis. Oxygen we can breathe in, but we also need nitrogen. Which ones do we need the nitrogen for? Every protein, remember, every little part of the protein has nitrogen in it. Nucleic acids also have nitrogens. We needed phosphorus for lipids. And also they're important for ATP, which is not a macromolecule. It's much smaller than these, but it's also a central molecule that we'll talk about. And the last thing I'm going to briefly mention is many proteins have lots of sulfur in it. And for reasons that we're going to talk more about, these R groups can contain sulfur. There's one specific amino acid that has sulfur, but that ends up being very important for the 3D structure of proteins. We won't get into that now, but sulfur ends up being a very important molecule. So you notice most of these, we can't just breathe in. We only breathe in the oxygen. We can drink in some water to get some hydrogen. But just drinking water and breathing air is not going to get you most of these. Most of these you have to consume for your diet. So the carbon, the nitrogen, the phosphorus, and the sulfur, we're going to have to get through the nutrients we consume. And so an interesting study is to explore where do these ultimately come from. We already mentioned photosynthesis, but all of these have an interesting biogeochemical cycle, how they eventually get to your body. But we talk about these because these are the essential elements you need for your body to build your cells, to build your protein, nucleic acids, lipids, and carbohydrates, which are the big building blocks which make each and every cell in your body. Okay, that's it for today. Much love. Have a good day.